Hello and welcome to a special episode of Independently Speaking. I am your host, Helen Stanton-Tonner, the Director of Education and Inclusion for ISA. Today we are having a roundtable discussion where we will be exploring the government's major proposals for change set out in SEND reform, putting children and young people first, and the school's white paper, Every Child Achieving and Thriving. Now, these reforms outline a system that is aiming for earlier, fairer, and more consistent support for children and young people with SEND, alongside stronger expectations around inclusion itself, collaboration, and mainstream provision. Now, today's conversation is particularly important because we're viewing these reforms through the lens of the independent education sector. While much of the national debate is naturally focusing on state-funded settings, independent schools, both in the mainstream and specialist, play a vital role in the whole SEND landscape, and they will experience their own opportunities and pressures as these reforms begin to take shape. Independent settings often serve highly diverse needs, and many provide specialist, therapeutic, or bespoke approaches that contribute meaningfully to the national offer. Understanding how these reforms may support or challenge or reshape this contribution is essential. To help us explore this, we are joined by a group of professionals who have either worked in or are working in schools, and they represent the breadth of independent provision. This includes Hannah Lovegrove Campion, the head of SEND at the Independent Schools Association, who is an experienced specialist in special educational needs and disabilities. We've got Michelle Catterson, the executive head teacher of Moonhall School, an independent specialist dyslexia school, and she is also nationally recognised as an expert in dyslexia, SEN leadership, and inclusive education through her role as chair of the British Dyslexia Association. Jonathan Hetherington, the headmaster of Morehouse School, which is an independent specialist school for learning disabilities and specific learning disabilities. And he is highly experienced in SEND-focused leadership and specialist provision. We also have Michael Smith, the CEO of Pivot Group, a specialist independent provision supporting neurodiverse learners with complex social, emotional, and learning needs. And he brings extensive expertise in alternative educational pathways and therapeutic provision. Together, they bring a collective perspective on what these reforms could mean for independent schools. Our aim today is to consider how the independent sector can continue to offer high quality, responsive provision within a national system that is evolving quite rapidly. One that seeks to strengthen early support, standardise expectations, and rebalance where and how children receive the help they need. We're going to explore not only the implications, but also the possibilities, how independent schools can adapt, collaborate, innovate, and continue to meet the needs of children and young people in a redesigned SEND landscape. Now, independent schools often use a range of early identification and support models, from screening tools to small group interventions to bespoke assessments. What approaches, Michelle, do you currently use in your setting to identify SEND needs early, and what makes these models really effective for the children you serve?
So I think it almost begins with our admissions process at the school, because we are a specialist school. So we ask for all the documentation, the EHCPs, any diagnostic assessments. So we actually are in a relatively fortunate position that we have quite a strong profile of the student. But I think many of us that work with kids with SEN will be very familiar with those children that maybe arrive at our schools who are labelled as fidgety or not concentrating or not engaging with the work. So sometimes that even when they come to our school and the parents are very aware of SEN, there's still some undiagnosed needs there. So we will pick up on that quite quickly, and thankfully that's due to the expertise of our staff. So typically that might be someone who has a diagnosis of dyslexia, but ADHD traits haven't been picked up. So we will use our in-house therapy team to identify those traits. We'll put some adaptations into the lessons. And I think one of the benefits that we have in a specialist setting is that we just have that awareness. So we're looking beyond the behaviour, and sometimes if there is a behavioural issue, is that demonstrating something maybe more deeper that's going on with that child. Being in small classes really helps as well. And it's not unusual for a child to come to Moon Hall with a certain profile, and then by the time they leave Moon Hall, we've sort of really narrowed down on what it is that they need help and support with, and the strategies that we could put in place.
With the government's proposed tiered system aiming for a more consistent early intervention in the mainstream settings, what challenges or opportunities could be seen for sort of mainstream settings implementing a sort of like this tiered model, and how might these shifts impact the role or expectations for independent schools within a wider SEND landscape?
So the reform sets out three interlocking tiers, and in short, these are targeted. So for children with ongoing and commonly occurring needs that can't necessarily be met by the universal offer. Targeted plus for children who need access to more specialist support, and then specialist. And these will be the children who will need a bespoke specialist package of support and will be entitled to an EHCP. And to my knowledge, you don't need to move through the tiers. But this tiered system has a real potential to reduce the postcode lottery that lots of families feel the burden of by giving mainstream schools a clearer, more consistent structure for early intervention. The challenge really is whether schools actually have the capacity and the expertise, the alignment across agencies to deliver each tier well. These thresholds and decision making and access to specialist input all need to be clearer, otherwise we risk creating more inconsistency rather than less. And I think with the bottlenecks in EP, SALT, OT and other specialist support packages at the moment, already very tight, this can be intensified. But I think for independent schools in particular, this shift creates both a bit of pressure but also opportunity. If mainstream schools are expected to hold complexity for longer, some families may still look to independent settings when the tiers aren't met consistently. And there's also a real opportunity here for settings within the independent sector to act as partners, not just those alternative placements. Through lots of shared collaboration, training, mentoring, expertise, short-term interventions, they can really help to strengthen the local SEND system rather than just sit outside of it. And I think parents ultimately need genuine choice, and the tiered model in essence should support that rather than restrict it. I think that we need to recognise the diverse contributions and value of independent schools, especially in delivering those kind of longer term outcomes for children.
Anyone else's thoughts?
Helen, I'd just like to come in a little bit. I have quite concerns over the tiered system. I think it sort of risks putting children into certain boxes and might not actually look at the profile of the child. And we know that children with neurodiversity quite often have a lot of co-occurring needs. And I just think with the white paper, there's just so much ambiguity and lack of clarity. And I appreciate that some of that will come. But who is going to be responsible for assessing these children? Is it going to be the class teacher? Is it going to be the SENCO? Or is there going to be a new operation set up that's looking at this? I worry also about teachers in the mainstream sector and the increased workload that this might have on them, trying to identify needs within their classroom. And I think we desperately need that clarity for reassurance for those in the mainstream sector, but for parents as well with SEN. The white paper, its leaks and delivery, the way that it's been launched has failed to provide that reassurance that families so desperately need.
Yes, there is a lot of ambiguity, isn't there, within it. Jonathan?
Yeah, if I might, I think Michelle's absolutely right. I think, we've got a white paper which is meant to answer all the questions that we've been sort of looking for, but of course what is missing out of it is the actual detail. I mean, you speak about, it speaks about specialist provision packages for the complex, but it also says really, really clearly within the SEND reform consultation document that we have no definition for complexity yet, and maybe that will come further down the line. I applaud really the sort of the headline aim, the ambition of the government, which is to make education more inclusive, to make schools able to meet the needs of all children. I think that is what should be happening. But we also recognise that really this is motivated by needing to control costs. And I think the real concern is, whilst I think you're absolutely right, Hannah, that I don't think, as was a concern a couple of weeks ago when something came out in the press, I don't think there will be a necessity to move step by step through the tiered process. But I think that will be the sort of assumption. Well, you start here, and if that hasn't worked, well, you need to try that first. And I do worry that there's a delay for the right support being put in place. Michelle's point about, well, who's going to make the decision? And I think this system is exactly that, which is, oh, well, we'll try a bit of this. Oh, well, that's not really yielding the success. So it's not really that anyone's making the decision. It's just it's not working, so we'll try the next thing. And that's not working, so then we'll try the next thing. And that will be, for most children, I think, the gateway to the next level. Rather than being able to jump apart from it in the most profound need cases. I know they're talking about children under the age of 5 who have particularly marked or specific conditions which will very obviously be permitted to have an EHCP. I mean, that's one of the key things. I don't know if necessarily all of our listeners have picked up on. The fact is that their ambition is that that only children who eventually get to the specialist provision package stage will be allowed to have an EHCP. And their aim is they expect the number of children on EHCPs to continue to rise for the time being until we get to about 2030. But by 2035, they hope their ambition is to have brought the EHCP numbers down to what the current levels are, which they say are 5.3% of the population. But yeah, I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that so much of this is about trying to control expenditure, which I get, it needs to happen. But at what cost? And I worry about the delay in the right support for the children, and therefore the impact on those schools. And if we're looking at what that means for then independent schools, Hannah spoke about choice and family choice, and I think that's a really pertinent point, because if schools are being encouraged to hold on for longer to more and more complexity, and I use that version of the word rather than complex, since as that's a specific word within the white paper, then what does that environment look like, and how many parents necessarily think that will be the ideal environment for their child in that school, and whether they will be more inclined to look for the independent sector.
I think absolutely everybody's saying some really good things there. One of my concerns when we're talking about inclusion at its widest sense, and we're talking focusing on the SND pupils that we've got here, we're at risk of excluding mainstream students who don't present SEN needs. Because what we're going to find is there's a lot of children being integrated into mainstream schools or held within mainstream schools longer. The assessment that's going to be there, the pressures, rightly said earlier on by Hannah, the pressures that are going to be placed upon staff to meet their needs. Well, actually, we all know the complexities that then children bring to the classroom setting. And we're expecting a lot of children to also sit alongside these children who are going through the mass education system and succeed in doing really well in that system. But the children that we're talking about do have a massive impact on them learning environments. So and then we've got the new Ofsted framework where there's more pressure placed on academic outcomes. How do we balance all this up? Because I think we're at risk of increasing permanent exclusions, managed moves, going backwards, because under the umbrella of, that's inclusion. Well, actually, I think we need to think about more equity when it comes to inclusion. What do people need at the right time, at the right place? And that's not always sat in a mainstream school. And the early intervention and that we're talking about, which again goes back to the Every Child Matters agenda, that was a huge focus around there. And the excellence in close excellence in cities that came around 5 years ago. I finished about 5 years ago. We found a lot of the in-house inclusion provisions being set up, which became in-house proofs. Therefore, behaviour actually escalated. Negative behaviour escalated within schools, and that put further pressure on schools. And we saw a lot more schools actually not achieving outcomes through inspection that they wanted to do because of behaviour and safeguarding and everything else. So I think we're setting schools up for a lot of challenge that's going to come their way, and sadly, it's going to impact on all children, not just the SEN children I'm talking about.
And Michael, you're talking there quite a lot about sort of the mainstream sort of settings. So do you think independent schools, mainstream or specialist, may also see changes in the type of needs they are asked to accommodate, or changes to parental expectation?
Absolutely. It's your top 3%, isn't it? That's always been the case. As long as education is it's your 3% of pupils that need that specialist kind of provision. I think we're going to be asked to be more clear on our offer and more specific in what we can offer, how we can deliver it, and how that's going to be delivered. But I think there's going to be a greater expectation about the relationships that we have with mainstream schools to help them and support them with the inclusive their own inclusive agenda. What we're looking at, there's such a range of additional need now that's been identified. Where the days gone by, it was your EBD students, PMLD students, and that was it. We've categorized, but now we've got neurodiversity and the whole range and the whole spectrum around there, which all of these different identifications of need take specialisms and specialist support, specialist resources, specialist training, specialist environments. It's not just the classroom. You've got to think about what does your environment look like in there. So our independent schools, we're set up, we can deal with that much better. Because we've got the time, we've got the resources, and we know what we're doing. We're being specialists. Mainstream schools can't do it all. But then educating the parents of what to expect and what is available out there. Because when we work with parents and they're obviously in crisis, so their children are going through where they don't want this to happen. What can we do to help and support? They don't know. We just want it fixing. We just want this problem fixing. And then parents, their expectations go up. Okay, we just want our students to be, and I'm talking about the early intervention, so we're talking about a lot of the primary students. We just want our children to be mainstream students, and that's great. And that if that can happen, absolutely, we should all work together. I don't care if it's public, private sector, whatever. We should work together to achieve that. But let's be real. The majority of children with complex needs are not going to get to that position. So therefore, we have to have the resources in place. We have to educate people to what is available currently. And that, again, will evolve and develop. We'll have to invest more in research. We'll have to invest more in resources and get to a place where children can be fully integrated in society. And that's after school.
And these reforms are obviously proposing that an increased access to that specialist advice in mainstream schools through, they've got initiatives such as Experts in Hand, the model that they've proposed, which they want to bring sort of health and education specialists into mainstream schools. Michelle, what is access to specialist support currently like for independent schools, therapies, EPs or external advisory services? And does this shape provision in the independent sector?
Yeah, I mean, this is perhaps another example of something that looks and sounds great, but the actual practicalities of securing this support and this level of expertise is really, really challenging. And you only have to ask any head teachers that have recently been trying to recruit for a speech and language therapist or an occupational therapist that they're like gold dust. They're really difficult to find, and to find really good quality individuals to employ in your setting. So there's definitely going to be a lag in time between being able to secure these individuals, to get them trained up to do their university courses and then be able to be out in the workforce. So I really worry about that. I also think it's very common knowledge about the wait times that a lot of families experience when looking for an educational psychologist assessment. In Surrey, if you want to go through the local authority, it's about an 18-month, 2-year wait for the educational psychologist. There's definitely a shortage of that level of expertise. So again, whilst it sounds like a really good initiative, and nobody would deny that. Everybody would think that's great, and the more specialists and experts that we can have, the better. But it doesn't seem to have the integrity behind that claim, and there seems to be a lack of connection and a real disconnect between what is actually practical in securing that support and having that in place for children, versus what the reality of the situation is with these experts and individuals. So I feel a lot of the white paper is saying the right thing, and people can't disagree with it, because who is going to disagree with that? Nobody could possibly disagree with it. It's a good statement to make. But it's not. I wonder how many of those in the Department for Education have actually spoken to head teachers who have been trying to recruit for these positions within their settings.
And do you think there are ways that the independent sector might be able to support maintained mainstream schools in accessing or modelling specialist input, particularly where independent settings such as your own already have strong multidisciplinary teams or established specialist practice?
Yeah, I mean, we try and do as much as we possibly can within our communities. We run SENCO workshops. We have an assessment centre here at Moonhall, so and that's run means tested to make sure that we're cutting down on that wait time for those families. But I think any head teacher is quite protective of their own school. And my initial concern is not that we wouldn't want to support, but is how is that going to impact on my own staff and my own children here at Moonhall? So yes, we absolutely do want to help, but we too are really struggling with recruitment and retention in those areas. So it might be that there's a willingness to support and help and to be one of those experts, but practically we can't support that despite all our best efforts.
And does that reflect your experience, Jonathan?
Yeah, so it absolutely does. We have quite a large speech and language therapy team at Morehouse, and occupational therapy as well. But it has definitely been one of our biggest strategic challenges over the last few years about how we maintain that level of provision, how we retain staff. I think one of the greatest problems is that so many speech and language therapists and OTs, occupational therapists, go into private practice. They'll start in the NHS, where essentially they are taught that actually delivering therapy is a fairly low order skill, and within 2 years you should be at the point where you are really sort of directing other people and perhaps doing assessments and reports. So many move into private practice. The scarcity of them, as Michelle says, is then what drives the costs of those up. How the government is going to be able to persuade them to return to working schools, or unless they're going to be contracted them privately, but the fees are going to be pretty exorbitant if they're going to make it worth their while. I do think there's enormous challenge here. It is touched on a little bit within the SEN reform consultation. They speak about wanting to work with the Royal Colleges, so the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists, the Royal College of Occupational Therapists, but language is at the root of absolutely everything. There are so many children who might be diagnosed with a literacy weakness, and actually, yes, that's absolutely there, but you realise that there's an underlying just speech and language difficulty, developmental language weakness, sequencing of ideas. Why is it difficult to write sentences? Well, actually, just trying to sequence ideas, find the right vocabulary, ordering things. It's so tricky within the. It's really interesting as well within the SEN. They are redefining the areas of need, or areas for development, as they're going to call them. And there is speech, language, and communication, but there seems to be a real complete lack within that of the recognition of the importance of inferential reasoning, and whether that's social inference or whether it is just that higher order language within the academic sphere, so reading between the lines, trying to generate ideas based from information that they need to use their inferential reasoning skills. That all seems it's so vital if a child is going to succeed socially within a school environment, because I think one of the things to really important, and that the schools need help with, exactly as Michael says as well, is not just how a teacher delivers in the classroom, but it's how we make a whole school environment the right environment where a child genuinely feels like they belong. We know the new Ofsted framework and indeed with ISI as well, but there's that rightly an emphasis on children feeling like they belong in a school, and the idea of moving to specialist hubs, sort of inclusion hubs in the schools, where there's a real danger that drives a real separation, a social separation between different types of children, and we need to be really cautious of that. As Michael says, specialist schools and independent schools can sometimes create a genuinely more inclusive environment for their type of children, where they really do feel that they are equal with their peers, that they are just as valid as anybody else, that they can contribute to that school in the same way as everybody else, and that drives up then that self-esteem. There is a real danger if we try to shoehorn too much into a mainstream secondary school, for example, or a mainstream primary school, that actually there's a danger that we don't meet anybody's needs very well. That was Michael's point earlier, wasn't it?
Yes, no, absolutely. And also the report, because we're talking about specifically about schools, but the report also talks a little bit about the shift with the responsibilities of local authorities. And some independent schools are already collaborating effectively with their local authorities, be it one or many, depending on the students that come to their school. They're also with NHS teams or mainstream schools where they share expertise, provide outreach, or some of them even develop joint intentions. Michael, within your settings, are you currently offering support to maintain schools at all in this way, or how might sort of these reforms strengthen such plans or expand them, or maybe even complicate them with these partnership opportunities?
Yeah, we would do a lot of outreach support. I think we feel like we're morally obliged to do that and to offer them services back out, as I know a lot of my peers do in the independent sector. Um, we've developed an in-house central team for our zones because again we had the challenges. We couldn't get an EP. Right, okay, we'll get an EP. We couldn't get the relationship with social workers, and a lot of our children have got the social care need. So we employ social workers. So we've got all that expertise. We've got speech and language therapists in-house, but we're very aware that other schools don't have that luxury. It's a luxury we work hard to achieve and to maintain. So we do offer them to free assessment services, with a drop in the conversations, the hour drop in. One of us, myself included, will have the conversation with head teachers, with leaders. How do they manage that kind of stuff? We don't kind of shout about it because I think it's just the right thing to be able to do. I think this will push it, so we're going to have to formalize them relationships. We'll have we'll have to allocate more time to going into mainstream schools. But if we can prevent some students going out and then actually having to access specialist provision, then absolutely, that's going to be a great use of our time. I do think, if you look at the white paper, the headline stuff, like everybody said, nobody can argue with any of it. There's some great headlines in there about early intervention. It's kind of real blue sky thinking. But the doing and the implementation of that is going to be a massive challenge. And when you look at the timeframes, where they're looking at 2029 and 2035, they talked about having been stable by then. Well, that's a lost generation potentially of learners that are going through and going to be involved in the overlap. And I think that's a really crucial part of making sure that children don't fall through the net at this point, and children still have access to the right support. Because as education is, once an idea is presented, okay, that's what we're doing, and everything's gonna be focused on moving to that. There's gonna have to be that transition. As we have to focus on children's transition into the various key stage, whether that's specialist or mainstream. So we have to ensure that we're getting the right support and offering that support back out into mainstream and into local authorities. I think we're forgetting, the local authorities have got the central team where they're holding, the caseworkers are in there. Are the caseworkers aware, and have they got the expertise and the specialism to be able to identify and work with them? So sometimes working with the caseworkers who are supporting the children and the families often pays dividends more than going straight into the school. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely does. And one of the sort of reforms which they want to bring in to try and meet that gap is obviously the individual support plans. and they want these to come in across all school types. Hannah, do you think there's any impact that you can foresee that these expectations might have on independent schools, particularly in terms of maybe their staffing, training, recording processes, or their whole school culture, considering it might not be explicitly the independent sector has to follow ISPs?
Yeah, I definitely think there are going to be stronger expectations around inclusion, consistency, record keeping, those processes. And I think there is a drive for kind of a more alignment with the kind of local authority and maintained sector. I think that there is the culture of singing from the same hymn sheet. It will therefore likely lead to additional capacity for the kind of more administrative tasks that come around that. So that kind of assessing, documentation, and the capacity there for reviewing those plans. And driving that whole school culture to be even more transparent and collaborative and evidence driven. I think even more so than the independent sector are kind of needing to do now. I think for many schools, that will build on the strengths and the infrastructure that's already there, but it will just kind of maybe need a bit more formalising, especially with that kind of consistent practice. And what that looks like in practice, could vary hugely across the country and dependent on setting. How that looks like depending on needs and different complexities of needs as well. The amount of children in a school with different support plans, ISPs, EHCPs, whatever that looks like. I don't know how that will kind of be there in practice when these independent schools already have their own very successful ways of being able to measure that. But I think, one thing that independent settings do really well is they already operate with that flexibility, with the kind of more nuanced advice and interventions, with those therapeutic approaches, the learning environments which are tailored to the needs of children. And I think that culture is something that that should be shared and that we can all kind of learn from, and should drive those ISPs throughout the sector.
And sort of with mainstream settings, they're sort of being asked to deliver sort of more early and adaptive support. I mean, Michael, you mentioned early support recognition earlier. Within the universal and targeted layers of these proposals, how might this shift affect relationships between independent and mainstream schools? And sort of what opportunities are there for independent schools in this sort of new possible environment to share practice or offer partnership-based support?
There is rich opportunity in this. I mean, independent schools, this is what we do best, isn't it? We create environments that work really, really well for our sorts of pupils, and being able to then have an opportunity to demonstrate that a little bit more widely. Why wouldn't we, if we are sort of bastions of excellence in our local area in terms of creating an environment that's really conducive to child well-being and to outcomes, why wouldn't we then want to go and be the named experts that are able to offer support and guidance about that? Because what an excellent sort of marketing opportunity anyway, if one was going to think of it in that sort of in that approach. It's almost cynical approach, but we all ultimately, anybody goes into education because they have a genuine vocation for it. We want the best outcomes for children, and we are, I think, as educators, naturally collaborative people. So building those relationships with other schools, being able to talk about what works well for us, and hey, if we're the ones offering advice, well, then it's really clear to parents. A lot of them will want to, if they have the ability to do so, if they have the capacity to do so, they will want to go directly to the source of the best advice. So I think there's rich opportunity there. But so the schools, certainly schools under the Independent Schools Council affiliated to ISC, For a long time, we've all recognised that we should be building partnerships, we should be showing our value, our worth, we should be contributing to the strength in the area, not just in our own school. And actually, it is collaborative. It's not just what we can do to support those schools, it's how we can learn from them as well, because I think none of us are probably have such high opinions of our own schools that we don't think we can continue to develop and continue to learn. And there is excellent practice happening in all manner of schools, whether it's state maintained or whether it's independent. So I think there is good opportunity for that. I do recognise that one things that we're called upon to do as school leaders is to try and identify risk and opportunity. And risks here, are we going to find that there is a delay in pupils potentially coming to us because there is a greater expectation on state maintained schools to be meeting needs better and to be being more inclusive? Possibly, yes. But in the same way, as we've also said, if they're not able to perform this effectively, if that's changing the environment, that might end up driving children to us as well. So I think it's a really mixed picture. With the individual support plans we've spoken about, I'm not sure it changes much. I think that's what good practice is, and I think it's probably what almost all of us, if not all of us, are doing anyway. If you've got a child who is on your SEND register, then you've got a plan for how you are supporting them. And I think, again, this is another thing where right at the start of the conversation, we spoke about a need for clarity in more detail. They talk about individual support plans without really helping us to understand what the expectation, what it's going to look like. And so will it be a load more work for us? I don't know. My reading of the SEND reform consultation is that they might move the review of EHCPs to being only at the end of key stages, but definitely expect an annual review of the individual support plan, and effectively the idea that they want to move EHCP so they're more focused on outcomes rather than actually what the input is. So I suppose a focus on what we would now recognise as being section E rather than section F of an EHCP, and that I suppose as the ISP, the individual support plan, is then the section F bit of it, really. But I don't know. That's there's so much that we're uncertain about at the moment. We've got this consultation that is now live, and then we'll wait and see.
Yeah, absolutely. And collaboration, as we've mentioned, sort of a lot at the moment, across local areas is quite a key part of these reforms as you read through the documentation. Hannah, do you think there are any barriers or openings for independent schools in taking part in these local partnerships that are sort of like are touched on within these reforms, whether through shared expertise, transition support, maybe training or other early help collaborations?
Yeah, I think collaborating and sharing information and not kind of gatekeeping that can only benefit children and young people, and also, inform practice in these settings as well. There's such a wealth of knowledge and innovation within the independent sector that I think local providers can really, can and should really benefit from. By consulting with SENCOs and head teachers, looking to develop those kind of hubs and bases. I mean, Michael earlier spoke about kind of environment, and I think we all know that even something like the colour of a paint on a classroom can have such an impact for some learners. So that more nuanced kind of expertise, I think, can be lent on. Offering those kind of short-term interventions or placements, filling those gaps, especially where there are long waiting lists, I think is such an opportunity, and just operating that flexibility that we often see. There needs to be a lot of work in training and upskilling teachers and staff that are working with children with special educational needs and disabilities. That's a real gap in teacher training at the moment. And I think that joint training and workforce development from the independent sector creates such an opportunity for the mainstream sector to really piggyback on that skill, and I think that's a real opportunity for independent schools to host INSET and CPD to kind of help co-train staff. I think, independent schools have such a huge amount to offer, and I think they're actively included and are, invited to the table as genuine partners that can only strengthen those pathways. Something that, I think often I see is that we're not invited to have a seat at the table. So although these reforms emphasise partnership, they don't automatically create those invitations to be a part of. So I think that, I think for LAs and local governments to prioritise that will hopefully enable and expand that provision, and therefore the independent sector can also leverage from that by having maybe more access to data or a whole part of that picture and what that looks like locally, rather than just kind of breadcrumbs of information that sometimes some of those settings are only offered.
Yeah, to really be an inclusive part of the SEND landscape rather than being seen as a sideline.
Absolutely. Being invited into those conversations and into that reform, I think is so important, and it'd be such a missed opportunity if local governments and even just nationally that's not recognised.
And Jonathan, you've already kind of touched on sort of the EHCPs and their sort of link to the new support plans that might come before them, with the EHCPs being increasingly reserved for the most complex needs, and more children expected to receive support within a mainstream setting before they receive one. How might this shift affect sort of maybe admissions patterns or demands for places, or maybe even the complexity of needs seen in independent specialist schools?
Thank you. I mean, what I think we should all recognise really clearly is so we have a Department for Education which is really quite anti-independent schools. We should recognise that in the Secretary of State at the moment. There's no secret to that. And I think we probably should recognise that their ambition is, their aim will be to reduce as far as possible funded EHCPs in certainly mainstream independent schools. So for some schools who do have a few of those, I think probably they plan for that to disappear. Let's also remember timeframes though. So they're talking about the fact that no current child is going to lose their EHCP, and these things, sort of looking 4 or 5 years down the line. But we should also think about a fairly immediate impact potentially on new ones coming in. So local authorities will be, if this is an opportunity to control expenditure. There are a lot of ISA schools who are specialist schools though, and complexity, again, let's go back to the point that we don't have a definition of complexity. Does that mean profound in terms of cognitive impairment? Does that mean just actually that there's more than one diagnosis and the comorbidity bit of it? It's so uncertain, it's so difficult to tell. We've also need to recognise that there's not suddenly going to be all of a sudden overnight brilliant extra new provision that's in the state maintained sector. We should also recognise that they're hoping by 2035 to have brought the number of EHCPs down to what the current level of EHCPs is now. So there's still a demand. There's still going to be a demand there. But undoubtedly, I think it does come down to an individual school. And I think you do need to be brave enough to try and do that risk exercise and try and think, what might this mean for us? What are our pupils? How many EHCPs funded by local authorities have we got at the moment? What's our profile of pupils? We know that the government's aim is to have more pupils educated within mainstream, state-maintained mainstream schools. Yes, they want to improve the number of specialist placements as well in the state-maintained provision, but so therefore, those who perhaps we might consider to be on the cusp of complex or not, those are clearly going to be the more risky ones. But again, are we going to find parents, even if they cannot your parents of children with SEN do not view the right schooling, and especially if it's an independent school, as a privilege or as a nice to have. They see it as absolute essential, and will forego all sorts of things in order to show, we still have a lot of parents in our country who are prepared to invest in their children's futures. And so therefore demonstrating exactly what we are able to offer, why we are able to meet need in a really good way. Outcomes, of course, is important, but we all recognise that outcomes is not just exam grades, it's also social outcomes, and it's how we prepare our students for the future. One of the big things the government is trying to fight against is NEETs. So those children who leave compulsory education, so at the age of 18, and then are not in employment or education or in training, effectively just at home. And I think we've got a really, really strong story to tell from so many ISA schools about how we can support neurodivergent children and those who are diagnosed with SEND who actually do have successful futures. And so there's something around being able to look as to what the longer term outcomes are for our schools, and then being able to tell that story really, really quickly, that if you invest in your child's education with us, then actually the future does genuinely look bright, and there's a track record here for that. And actually, are you willing to risk not, taking that pathway? So perhaps the thing for us to do is to think maybe some of our schools will need to be a little bit more deliberate in marketing ourselves, in sort of showing what we are, rather than perhaps just assuming. But I do think it's school dependent, and I do think there are quite a lot of ISA schools for whom it's unlikely to change things a great deal because they are already specialist. We know that there's going to be, they say there is likely to be approximately 7 bands of special provision package. And they are going to be, that's going to have a sort of a fee banding that's going to be defined nationally. There is so much we don't know yet. It's really, really unclear, and that makes it really difficult for school leadership teams.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And these specialist sort of provision packages, or SPPs as they've sort of been named, Michael, how might such standardization affect distinctive approaches or innovative models that maybe you offer, or similar settings to yours might offer, where obviously flexibility needs to be preserved to maintain that high quality specialist practice?
Yeah, well, just on the SPPs, I think it's an essential part of what we're talking about, because one of my great concerns is if we put so much pressure on mainstreams to educate the students that we're talking about, they're going to look for creative ways of filling the time, won't they, with least disruption to the whole site. That opens up a massive market again, which we've been in a few years ago, and we're getting, hopefully we'd resolve that, of unregistered provision, of provisions that are just offering certain kinds of interventions or leisure interventions with very little or very poor learning outcomes, whether that be academic or social. But what it does do is give them a tick in the register saying, there you go, that's where we can go. So in order to QA and standardize the provision nationally is absolutely, welcomed by us and everybody else who I've spoken to so far. But it'll also allow the parents to understand what offers are out there and give it a very clear kind of expectation, some clear information of what they can expect, what outcomes that they'll be in for, and how they're going to deliver on themselves. So the provision map will actually be there very clear. Again, what I keep coming back to what everybody's talking about, we're reinventing a lot here. We talk about individual learning plans, IEPs, ISPs, and it's all language that keeps getting rehashed and bringing back to the forefront. That can cause confusion. But until we get to the point where we are fully trained and fully supported, and people are understanding what different offers are available, but who's going to do the QA on a national basis? And I think that's one thing that ISA do remarkably well. Look at the people that we've got sat around the table today. We've got national coverage. The meetings that we have, the SEN meetings, it's national coverage. So we're all talking about the same thing. So when they're talking about digitizing the documents. I welcome that, absolutely, because it'll hold everybody to account on a national level about provision for the most vulnerable students. But who and how's that going to be done? Because every authority will have a slightly different understanding of how and when. So is that going to go back to the DfE? Are they going to have to manage that? Who are they going to allocate that out to? But I think we're in a great position to be able to offer that support because of the work that we're doing together. Formats, we're sharing templates, we're understanding what needs are out there.
And Michelle, do you think the reforms create any new opportunities or new pressures for specialist independent schools to support local systems or to work closer with local authorities, particularly if mainstream schools are being expected to retain more pupils with moderate or emerging needs?
Yeah, I mean, I really hope so. It's something that we've been trying to do, and I know that the ISA sector and the independent sector have been trying to do for a long time, is to forge stronger relationships with our mainstream state sector counterparts. I think there is a sort of a deliberate narrative from our current Department for Education to create a them and us situation, but that's not what we feel as an independent sector. We want to help because ultimately, if we're reaching out to local schools, we're helping the students, we're helping the staff, and that's what we want to do. We want to help as many children as possible to have that access to support. And it's one thing that's been very disappointing with our education secretary, that there has been that line drawn between the state sector and the independent sector, and I think there's been no secret made, as Jonathan said, about their lack of preference for the independent sector schools. And I wrote to Bridget Phillipson at the beginning of February and spoke about the important role that the independent specialist schools provide, and gave a sort of cost analysis between what our fees are versus what it costs to educate a child in the mainstream sector, with all of this support added on top. And actually, we provide very good value for money for local authorities. I got a reply on Monday. I was trying to find it in my phone there to remember exactly what it said. I'm sure you can assume and predict what it said. There was a sort of response on that independent schools are far more expensive than state special schools. Not true. There is also a comment made about outcomes being lower in some independent special schools. Again, not true. And I think these headlines that are sort of being pushed out by civil servants and those in the Department for Education are really, really unfair. They don't provide a clear picture of what schools like ours do and what we provide. They keep talking about the sort of average specialist school fee and the sort of maximum specialist school fee in the independent sector. My school is nowhere near the average specialist school fee. We're a charity. We're not private equity owned. We don't profiteer, as our education minister liked to accuse some schools in the sector. None of our specialist schools do. We're there because there's a need for schools like ours, and parents want to send their children to schools like ours because they have tried the alternative. They have tried mainstream sector schools, and for whatever reason, despite the best efforts of the amazing schools that are out there and the amazing state school staff, it just hasn't worked for that child. And I think I say this in a lot of interviews that I do. We're not against state sector schools. I'm a product of a state school education. My children have went to a mixture of state school and independent school just based on our own family circumstances. I've been a governor in a state school. I really have met the most amazing head teachers that are doing the most wonderful job in the most difficult of circumstances with very limited funds. I genuinely hope that for those schools that have high ambitions for their students with special educational needs, that the white paper does provide them with the finances, the resources, and the capacity to be able to help support those children. We do not want to see this fail at all. But what I would really, really love, and to go back to my sort of opening point here, is for our education secretary to realise the key role that schools like ours play in providing spaces for children that could ultimately not be educated elsewhere. That's why they ultimately end up in our school setting. I'm pretty sure if you to ask a lot of special needs parents and students, would they prefer to go to the school that's 5 minutes down the road and they can walk there and walk with their friends and come home at 4 o'clock or whatever, or go to a specialist provision where it might be a half an hour, 45-minute journey, and maybe they'll have a different circle of friends? We know what those families would prefer to do, but the fact is the provision is not there, the support is not there, and I genuinely worry that we're setting our children up to fail, to kind of then prove that it doesn't work, when actually we already know that inclusion units and special needs units don't work. Children feel different, they feel isolated. It's the complete opposite of inclusion, it's actually exclusion. And I fail to see from the white paper and the points that have been raised that actually inclusion will be better or improved, because nothing that I've seen actually demonstrates that those children's needs will be met within a classroom setting. All of the extra support that they're talking about has to actually take place out with the classroom and out with specialists in a different area of the school. Perhaps as part of the consultation, that will be something that's voiced and raised, and we'll see differences there. And just the last thing to add, when I did invite the Education Secretary to come visit schools like Moon Hall and all the schools from the panels that we have here, her diary is very busy. And she unfortunately can't make it, which I do understand, but wouldn't it be lovely if some of those from the Department for Education actually came and saw for themselves the difference that specialist independent schools provide for children?
Michael, if these reforms did successfully manage early intervention and the inclusion was strong within mainstream schools, how might the role of independent or alternative provisions, such as yours, evolve, particularly if fewer pupils are expected to reach the point of requiring those placements?
I think how it would hopefully, and I do say with hope, is to be acknowledged and recognized as the specialist services that we provide, and an integral part to decision making, not just from an independent point of view. Because I think what Jonathan mentioned, the headlines that have been coming around profiteering has really damaged the independent sector and the work that's been done. Some amazing work, it's amazing work with students who, when all else has failed, independent has picked them up, supported them, make them feel valued, make them feel included, and gone on to do some great things. So I think hopefully we will become a real integral part of the decision making, not from a strategic point of view. Because look at the skill set that we've got. We manage, we don't manage budget, we manage cash flow. We operating costs. So we can help and support local authorities and able to do that, and to be able to ensure that we're reducing cost and being much more efficient in how we deliver our services, because that enables us to deliver more services and to reinvest. So there's a commercial element to it, that. But when it comes to the delivery of service, again, being the experts, not just being the experts in the decision making on an authority level, but working with partners and partnerships of schools. Having that responsibility. If you're working with a local authority, the partnership, the schools that are around you, how can we be involved in their panels around support, around what we're delivering? I think that this is a great opportunity to pull the public and private sector together in order for the young people to benefit from everywhere. And that will reduce cost, because as a result is your schools won't have to tap into some services that they're going to have to currently to CAMS or NHS or wherever. They'll be able to say it's on our doorstep. Our provision's there. We can work with that provision. They can come in. They can help us with the assessment of students. And then I think that will hopefully, again, I'll do ever the optimist. I do live in hope that we will be able to be that center of the collaboration.
And Michael, the reforms also have a huge focus, don't they, on attendance, belonging, and consistent expectations of behaviour. Now, this is an area where independent schools really quite excel, but how can they ensure that accountability pressures don't undermine the inclusive practice or personalised support that they offer?
We have to be realistic when we talk about attendance and behaviour, because what's taken is a national average, which includes all schools, so maintained schools, again, the mass education, which a lot of the students that they're measuring against have got stable homes, have got stable backgrounds, haven't got the range of needs that they're having to deal with on a daily basis, from sleep patterns and everything else. So actually, we've got to be realistic in what we're expecting around attendance, around behaviour, because one thing that's behavioural need in a specialist provision, if we're talking SMH provision, is actually just what we have to do because that's their personality. That's what we manage. We have to put strategies in place in order to deal with that. In a mainstream school, that's a huge incident which will trigger a permanent exclusion at some point. Yeah, the attendance. We've got students who have come to us. Emotional based school avoidance is a big focus for us at the minute, and I think that's an area that's going to evolve, and nationally, and it already is. We're talking about students coming with 0% attendance, and then within weeks they're up to 60-70%. Now people say, yeah, but they're not your national average, are they? Well, no, they're not, and they're still a way off that. But actually, to have that kind of improvement in attendance is huge and a great success. That's not a time to criticise. That's a time to celebrate. And then you catch it, success generates success, doesn't it? Keep moving, keep working, keep supporting them, but helping mainstream schools to develop them attendance strategies that we're doing. So I think that's a key way.
And we've already touched on through some of the things you've said, Michelle, about sort of independent settings contributing to national conversations. But Jonathan, under these new reforms, is there a way for the independent sector to influence the broader system in a positive way?
I think lots of us, and I sort of look across at Michelle here, I think we've been trying to bang the drum on this for quite a long time. I mean, Michelle, it's really good to hear of her speaking about her bombarding the Secretary of State with letters and things, and I'm glad that it's not just me. And actually, I don't know, one uses all sorts of resources. If you think about our school communities and all of our parents and things, sometimes you find somebody has a connection and you can slightly you can use that as a way in or something. I managed to almost by chance have a really decent conversation with Lord Blunkett not that long ago now. Some of you might remember him being the Education Secretary back in 1997 when Tony Blair took over, and it was education. And I said, I'm banging my head against the wall. We are working, our school, our one school, which like Michelle's is just another charitable school, is supporting currently 275 schools across the United Kingdom to be more inclusive. Mainstream schools, quite a lot of independent schools, but quite a lot of state maintained schools as well. I said, and we can really help the government deliver on their agenda. If they really want to make schools inclusive, we can certainly help. And I agree with Michael. I don't think schools can meet in the best way the needs of every child. We recognise, the brilliance of the independent sector is that we offer diversity. We offer different environments, and it doesn't matter. Even if hubs did work, and I agree with Michelle that hubs, I think, become socially exclusive, those sort of inclusive hubs within state schools. But nevertheless, even with the most inclusive environment, a state secondary school of 2,000 children, but there are some children who are never going to cope with that. Michael was just talking about emotional based school avoidance, those who just can't cope or too sensory to manage that sort of environment. But nevertheless, there is much that can be done, and we can really help with that if only we're allowed to. And we spoke earlier about the Education Secretary at the moment, but it's much wider than that. A government that is pretty anti-independent school. Let's not forget a government that not only introduced VAT on school fees and therefore becoming, I think, the first country to tax education, but decided to do it with only about 6 weeks' notice as well, in order to cause, if that's not the politics of division and trying to cause damage, I don't know what is. So we are battling against, it's definitely a really uphill struggle. But I've been encouraged that I've got contacted finally by the Department for Education's Director of Special Educational Needs, who has said that, look, everybody tells me I have to come and see you at Morehouse and understand what you're doing. So she is coming to us, and it gives, you know, I sometimes like to be naive, and I hope that it gives us an opportunity to try and shape government policy a little bit. I think, you know, this is the important thing. We've all said it's not independent schools or no independent schools. We should just, especially those of us who are delivering specialist provision, should be recognised as part of the landscape, and we shouldn't deny parents and children access to some of the most profoundly effective and impactful provision, just in the name of some ideology that says, actually, really, if everyone can't access it, then nobody should be able to. You know, let's level up and not level down. So I think we should all be working to try and influence. We've talked about what we can do on a more local scale. We've talked about partnerships with local schools, how we can become genuinely good partners in developing educational provision with state schools that are around us. But then through that broadens out, you know, what connections do your governors or directors or parents or even teaching staff have, that we might then be able to use that in order to continue. And I think we have to be brave and not give up. I think we have to continue speaking sense. You know, let's do our best to try and speak truth to power. Because why are we doing it? Well, ultimately we're doing it because we genuinely believe it is in the interests of children. So therefore that's our banner. That's what should give us that encouragement. That's the Weetabix, if you like, that we've eaten in the morning, and we keep reminding ourselves of that, and keep trying to advocate for what we know is just really good practice, really effective practice, and really good value for money as well.
And you're right, it's keeping the child at the centre of everything, isn't it? And at the forefront of our minds. And Michelle, obviously the implementation, as we've said already, stretches forward from 2029 to 2035. Are there any sort of impacts that you foresee for pupils and families on such a transition period?
So I made the decision to write to my parents about the white paper. I think it was Friday last week, just to reassure them and to sort of summarise things for them. And I had a really positive response from all of the parents, that they felt a little bit relieved, because they're reading the headlines. They're seeing the sort of leaks from the Department for Education. They're worried about their children's future. And I think it's really challenging for parents, especially those who have a child with SEN, because they've fought so hard to advocate for their child and to get the right support in place. I was on a panel yesterday, and I shared with the head teachers that were at that conference the letter that I sent to parents. I also shared with them the template letter to send to their local MP, and then in addition to that, some points that we might want to include in the consultation, because the consultation is so important. We've got 12 weeks to kind of give our views and our feedback on the white paper. And I think there's nothing more powerful than a parent's voice who's been through a situation that can directly compare and contrast between the provision that they have now and that their child is benefiting from versus what hasn't worked previously in the past. So I think that direct and open communication with your parents is just going to be essential, because they are worried, they are concerned. I haven't seen any sort of direct impact, if you like, from the white paper itself. I think generally what I'm noticing at my school, and I don't know if it's the same with other schools, since VAT was introduced, we have parents that are maybe holding off on signing up, as opposed to we might have had lots of numbers in our younger year groups. Parents are now typically maybe keeping their child at their current school for a little bit longer and then moving at a transition point. So our year 7 is actually almost double the size forecast for September than it has been in previous years, but we're seeing less numbers in the younger years. That concerns me a little bit, because we're actually getting children that are coming to join us in year 7 who are really fallen far behind and who really have needed that extra support much earlier on, and that can be more challenging. So that's the kind of shift I'm noticing just generally in my school, but nothing really immediate or urgent in terms of the white paper at this point in time. And I think that actually comes from the fact that there's no clarity. The white paper says a lot of things, but nothing at the same time. So parents aren't quite sure how to feel about it. Is this good? Should I be challenging it? What does it mean for my child? There's just not enough information that's been provided so far.
And sort of with that sort of thought of the lack of information, Michael, is there any specific support guidance or collaboration frameworks that could give more clarity or communication from government possibly that would be really helpful for the independent sector to navigate these reforms productively?
Yeah, I think because we really, it's a cost-cutting exercise as well. You know, we talked about that. We're not shy about that. Everybody's aware of it. We need to be clear in, okay, you're talking about no profiteering, don't like the profiteering. What do you class as a healthy profit? What do you class as a profit that that can contribute to a sustainable business? Because I've had some commissioners saying, well, we're going to cap it at 4% your profit margin. Well, tell me a business in any sector that can develop, grow on a 4% margin, unless we're talking about billions turnover. So we need I think they need a better understanding of what commerciality is and what a business plan is, how to get that. And if they look at MATs, for a perfect example, is how they manage their budgets, because obviously a lot of the central costs are held still by local authorities, so that doesn't come into it. So when they talk about comparable between what is the cost of a private place and what's cost of a state place, well, actually, it's not a true comparison. So we need to understand is, okay, what's your central on cost that contribute to them numbers? And so we need some further clarity on that. But actually, we still need to be a sustainable business. And to be a sustainable business, that means we can invest in staff. And the majority of our budget personally goes into staff development and training, you know, the students, what we're getting in there. So some clarity around, okay, so what is your commissioning model? So a lot of the commissioning models nationally at the minute don't allow for debt to be carried within the business. Well, in order for a business to not have debt, the only way they can raise capital is by private equity investment or equity investment of so therefore you're creating your own beast. But okay, so what is the commissioning model? How do you understand? But that is an understanding. It's a language difference as well between the public and private sector. How do we pull them two together? Which is a real challenge. And I think that comes from the communication and the sitting down, not sitting down with your biggest providers, because they're the ones who are, but sitting down with the smaller providers, sitting down with ISA who can represent a significant voice nationally. I say this is how it does work. So I think that'd be something that get us a great amount of clarity.
And may I just say really quickly on that you know that you speak well, obviously you speak so much sense, but you know there is so much truth in everything you say there, and it cannot just be this sort of political headline narrative. It's far more nuanced than that, and our children are worth far more than that. We need to get it right. You can't just say not for profit good, for profit bad, because I think there's probably lots of examples of charities that don't deliver good value for money. They're fairly poorly run, for example, and there'll be really good, lots of examples of for-profit companies who deliver far better value for money because they're running it far better. So you know there cannot just be these simplistic, almost arbitrary statements. I think it's all about value for money, and I think that's what our schools in ISA should be able to, I'm sure, should be able to absolutely sing and dance about. We should be able to demonstrate exactly how we offer really extraordinary value for money. So that is, of course, there's a financial income element to it, but what are they getting for it? And when Michelle spoke about that, the response from Bridget Phillipson, and you say, oh yes, and of course, and outcomes in special schools are poor. We've got some fantastic outcomes for students that are being educated in our schools. So we must make sure that we have an opportunity to demonstrate that. It is so important.
And
Yeah.
absolutely. And I think sort of as we bring this conversation to a close, I think that's an excellent point for us to conclude on. I want to extend a sincere thank you to each of our guests, Hannah, Michelle, Jonathan, and Michael, for sharing your experience and your insight and being candid today in your responses. Your perspectives highlight not only the diversity within the independent sector, but also its deep commitment to children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities. Now, these reforms present, they both a challenge, but also opportunity. And it's clear from our discussion that independent schools have got a really important role to play in shaping a system that is genuinely more inclusive, more responsive, and more coherent for families, that puts the children right at the centre of everything it does. Thank you as well to our listeners for joining us for this vital conversation. We hope today's reflections help you consider what these reforms might mean for your own context and how independent schools can continue to collaborate, innovate, and advocate for the national landscape as it resolves. Until next time, stay curious, stay connected.